My own feeling would be to ask the question, you know, what is medicine? And in the United States, we have a tradition of First Nations people, or what we sometimes call Native American culture, in which medicine is much more broadly defined. I've been doing some research on how consumers use psychiatric medications in the United States. And one of the gentlemen that I was interviewing about his experience with psychiatric meds, he said, "Pat, what is medicine?" He said, medicine changes your biochemistry, but chocolate changes your biochemistry, good sex changes your biochemistry, laughter changes your biochemistry, sunshine, exercise, diet, friendship, laughter, all of these things change our biochemistry.
Yeah, because my thing, I think it's very interesting how the brain works. But why couldn't we do research about how you can change your brain chemistry by joyful things?
And the truth is, there is some research which shows us that, in fact, all of these things change our biochemistry. And I think what I learned from this is, first of all, that none of us just use a pill and then the pill recovers us. That's not how it happens. That recovery is not about changing our biochemistry, it's about changing our lives. And what I found in my research is that people who sit back and simply swallow pills don't get a better life. Swallowing pills doesn't get a job for me. Swallowing pills doesn't, make me a better parent. Swallowing pills will not get me the car I want.
Isn't it also important to separate the mental illness from the fact that you've lost your role in life? Because in Denmark, research has shown that no matter what kind of illness you are having, then if it is a bad leg or bad heart, if you're out of employment for 3 months, then 50% of the people will never get back into employment. And that shows it's just not the illness, it's the social exclusion and the being out of every kind of meaning that hurts you.
I totally agree. I totally agree. And what I'm trying to say is that I think people make this artificial distinction between pill medicine and personal medicine, the things in our lives that give it meaning and purpose, the things in our lives that bring us joy, that challenge us to become even better people and do things we never thought we could do. This is personal medicine, and I think that the myth is, oh, just swallow a pill and you'll be well, and I don't believe it. I find, both through my research and through my experience, is that it's by changing our lives, by daring to take on valued social roles, that by daring to try out new things, and not always just the socially predictable things, you know, but sometimes wild things, you know, that we find our own path to recovery. Once having gone grocery shopping a few times and starting to make some small steps, it dawned on me that if I was going to become Dr. Deegan, I had better go to school. So, once making the decision to go to school, there were many new challenges that faced me, and I had to begin to develop some coping strategies. So I want to just share some of these very briefly with you. No street drugs. I found out at a very young age, like most young teenagers, I experimented with marijuana and found that for me the mix was very bad. My friends all had fun, I freaked out, and so I just intuited that this was not good for me. And in the long run, I'm glad I stayed away from street drugs because I do tend to have a sensitivity to drugs. A tolerant environment. They kept trying to put me in a halfway house. And the thing about halfway houses is that you kind of have to be more normal than normal. You have to make your bed every morning, you have to do your chore, you have to shower by 6 in the evening. And I mean, who really makes their bed every morning in the real world, right? I instead lived in a single room with a little hot plate, a very quiet life for a number of years as I was starting to go back to school, taking one course at the local community college, starting just with that one course. And I couldn't even I couldn't even learn anything in the classroom. I brought a tape recorder, and I tape recorded the lectures because I wasn't there to learn, I was there to see if I could make it through the class. And I had to figure out, how am I going to deal with these voices? How am I going to concentrate on the lecture? I need to I used to sit there and just watch my watch. Can I make it another 2 minutes, 2 more minutes, 2 more minutes? before I race out of the classroom in terror. So for me, these first years were a time of not learning in the classroom, just trying to be there. And then when I felt better, I could sit and listen to the lectures on the tape. So for me, eventually I moved in with a group of what I like to call latter-day hippies. I'm not quite old enough to have known the real hippies, but this group of people that I was living with were very into altered states of consciousness. So they were frequently doing yoga and meditation and raising the kundalini, and they were reading auras and astral projection. And I was walking around talking to people they couldn't see, and instead of freaking out and calling psychiatric services, instead they had the attitude of, wow, how do you do that? Teach us to do this. It's And I think importantly, this tolerant environment allowed me to have the opportunity to not have overly reactive helpers around me. Because sometimes I'm concerned that maybe the helpers need a little tranquilizing pill. Calm down, it's all right. I'm just a little mad right now, but this will pass. And that's a very important lesson that I began to learn. I was still taking psychotropic medications. I was still going for my weekly psychiatry appointment, and I was still going for psychotherapy while going to college. Very active in my treatment, but I also was intermittently going in and out of psychosis, and it offered me the opportunity to do what I call explore the terrain or the topography of my own madness. I learned not to be as afraid. I learned that I didn't have to drug everything away, and I also learned that medications didn't help with a significant number of the types of distress that I was dealing with. The medications never really helped at all with the distressing voices and other things.
The problem about medicine in Denmark is also that it's not a question of choice.
No?
People, they're not allowed to take medicine or say, I don't want any medicine.
Ah.
What do you think about the use or the non-use of medicine?
I don't think that the use or non-use of medicine is a moral issue. I think medicine is exactly that. It's, and I'm talking here about what I call pill medicine. Pill medicine is exactly that. It can be helpful at times. I've seen and I know individuals for whom medications have truly helped the recovery process. I'm a person for whom medications have never been particularly effective or particularly helpful, although there are times when I use medications and times when I don't. We have been so brainwashed to believe that psychopharmacology is the answer that we forget about the incredible resources that people can bring to bear on their own recovery and wellness. A researcher named Vaughan Carr, a psychiatrist in Australia, found this when he interviewed, or he asked 92 research participants diagnosed with schizophrenia to complete a survey on coping strategies, and Vaughan Carr had 57 coping strategies for people to check off on his survey. And he was so astonished because once people had finished with his 57 little items on his survey, people spontaneously told interviewers about 350 coping strategies that they were using independently in the community. And this blew his study out of the water, and he had to write a whole other paper about this finding. And he concludes that from the foregoing, it should appear obvious that schizophrenic patients are not simply passive victims of their illness. On the contrary, patients can play an active role in the management of their illness, particularly in the containment of its symptoms. The experience of schizophrenia is evidently a learning process in which patients make active attempts to master the illness and not have it dominate them. It's not a moral issue. To me, it's a very practical issue. I've also seen times when medications, when they're given in what we call polypharmacy, there are too many medications given at one time or too much of one medication given, where medication can actually prevent you from recovering. If you can't get up in the morning because you're too tired, if you're so snowed and wiped out and zombified like a robot, feeling like the living dead on haloperidol, that's not recovery. And mental health professionals try to tell us that might be recovery, but you and I know that that's not recovery. That's living in a vegetative state. That's drug-induced coma, and that's not recovery either. For me, it is absolutely an issue of choice and self-determination to become very wise about how we choose to use medications, if we choose to use them at all. There's a great deal that we as service users need to learn. And I think that the industry of mental health, because it's important that we realize that it is an industry which is strongly driven by the profits of the pharmaceutical companies. And this I find very disturbing, that the pharmaceutical companies are making more money than you and I could even count that high, billions of dollars every year. And institutional psychiatry is in a very incestuous relationship with the pharmaceutical industries in a way that's quite disturbing. It's very difficult to find research on psychopharmacological agents that is not directly funded in some fashion by drug companies, either through a university or independently by their own laboratories. So that the field is quite contaminated in terms of being able to find any reliable empirical data. And this is very problematic, I think. And something that we should be very worried about. I found that a tolerant environment that allowed me to not be so afraid of my madness and to learn some of the signs, and I call them signposts, along my road through psychosis, that there was a type of method in my madness, that I learned that, oh, if I entertain these kinds of thoughts, that will lead me down a road into delusions. So if I want to avoid delusions, I need to not be thinking about or entertaining this type of thinking. And I learned, oh, here are those kind of voices again. And eventually I was able to say, you know what? It seems that whenever I have had a bad argument with my family, my voices get worse. So there's a connection here. So when the holidays come, either I'm not going to visit, or I'm going to be sure not to have a big argument. And so learning little things like this was very important for me. Other ones, just briefly, relationships. In the beginning of my recovery, I had very little energy for relationships. I very much wanted to be alone, but importantly, I didn't want to be lonely. I wanted to be alone. I wanted to know that there were people around me that I could reach out to if I needed you, but mostly I didn't need you. Mostly I wanted to be alone. But knowing that people were caring about me when I didn't even have the energy to care too much back was important. Eventually, and in the course of my life, my relationships have grown more and more mutual, more and more reciprocal. As I said, the future is ambiguous and uncertain. Today, I am the mother of a 7-year-old girl and have been with my life partner now for 18 years, something I never would have anticipated as standing back in these early days of my recovery. So life is interesting. Spirituality, finding meaning in my suffering. This was very important to me. The idea that, that the suffering that I was going through, I could use it to help other people, and that it wasn't futile, that there was some meaning and purpose to it.
How can you, if you're a mental patient today, how can you then change the way that the journals are written? You know, how can you change the focus from my diagnosis to the whole person?
Yes. I think that to change the focus, we need to continue to speak up and participate. That professionals find it very difficult to talk about us as things and as diseases if we are sitting there with them at the same meeting.
If we are there.
If we are there. If we are there in numbers, it's particularly difficult. So the more we can be present in decisions that are made about us, the saying from South Africa, nothing about us without us, that we must be a part of all decisions, both regarding services and policies, procedures, how money is spent, as well as our own treatment. then I think we can continue to insert our human story into what is essentially a pathology discourse, and thereby humanize it. We can begin to write journal articles ourselves. I think if we took account in private, we might be surprised at how many mental health professionals themselves have also at some time been a patient. I can't tell you how many come forward and say to me, shh, but when I was young, or when, you know, they actually spent time in hospital. Mm-hmm. And so I think that some of them really do understand what we're talking about and are potential allies. I've already talked to you about my sense of purpose and direction and daring to have a dream. Routine was very important to me. Sometimes my routine would hold me when nothing else would. I like to do the same thing over and over again, especially in the early years. A new relationship to time, taking things a day at a time, an hour at a time, and even sometimes at a minute at a time. The reason I mention this is because it's easy in the early stages of recovery to be thinking way far down the road, to be thinking about how bad things are today and wondering, how am I ever going to get to where I want to be? And although for me it was really important to have a dream that was off in the future, it was also really important to keep my gaze focused on what's the next thing I need to do. And somehow learning to balance that, not giving up on the dream in the future, but not forgetting that it would take many steps to get there, was an important balance to strike. Sometimes I could feel very discouraged, as I'm sure many of you in the audience can relate to, that sometimes the simplest things seem so difficult on any given day, or particularly during a time of setback, when I thought I had finished with all of that distress, and suddenly I found myself back in it. I could feel deeply discouraged, as if I had done something terribly wrong, or why couldn't I just get smart and get right? And the idea of having some patience, that this was going to take some effort over a longer period of time, that this wasn't going to be fixed by some pill or by some magic counseling or some magic bullet, but rather it was going to be a human process, this recovery. It was about growth, and it would take time. Studying, learning, and working were important for me. Eventually, in my 30s, began to do pretty intensive psychotherapy to work through a history of childhood trauma. Many of us who are in psychiatric services have a history of either childhood sexual, physical, or emotional abuse, domestic battering, rape, a very high preponderance, statistically, of people in long-term care have such histories. And sometimes there's an argument made that we shouldn't do psychotherapy that is about this trauma work. And I would have to very much disagree. I think that that sets us apart as somehow different than other people who feel a need at different points in life to re-examine this history. What my experience was that it was the timing of when to do this work was very important. So that to have I remember saying to the psychiatrist who was my therapist early on that I wanted to work on this history in the early days of my recovery. And he said, no, but never gave me a very good reason. But now I look back, and there was some wisdom in not doing the work early on. And that, for me, the wisdom was that I didn't have a strong enough sense of myself in the present. And I wasn't sure enough about where I was going in the future. And I didn't have a good enough support system together in the present in order to look back at the past. By my 30s, I had that in place and was able to do some work, although it was very difficult.
One last question is that I think it's very important that you distinguish between the medicine, which apart from it's this thing about profits, then I consider that as being clean, and then the power and the power systems that force medicine on top of people and put it down their throats like a frog, goose. Whatever. Yeah. I mean, it's important to distinguish between the power systems and the medicine itself.
Yes, although it can be difficult because the two are so intertwined. I think that we have a pretty big myth of mental illness going on. I think that the real science behind psychiatry is actually quite weak, that psychiatry is very much in its infancy, but has a pretty big head about itself. That there's very little that we know about the workings of the human brain. We know a heck of a lot more about the workings of the human heart, and that if we can get our head around that, I mean, just something as simple as trying to define what a biochemical imbalance is. I mean, they talk about that all the time, that people with mental illness have a biochemical imbalance. But we can't describe empirically what biochemical balance is, so therefore how could we define what imbalance is?
I also say that there's no such thing as mental illness, but you can be so distressed that you can't function at all.
Yeah, you know, I'm too much of a scientist to be able to say flat out there's no such thing as mental illness, but what I will agree to, in terms of my own thinking, is that if there is, we don't have a clue about, you know, really much about it. We really don't know. What we do know a lot about are the variations and struggles of the human heart, and that, and we also live in, you know, very westernized countries where the limits about human experiences are terribly narrowed down. That who might be a shaman in one culture is a madman in this culture, who might be a prophet in this culture, in our culture, is considered mentally ill. And I worry about that sometimes, that the parameters of what's considered appropriate.
That's also why they say that in the underdeveloped countries, and people with schizophrenia, they recover much more than they do in the industrialized countries.
Yeah.
Because there's a little role that the people can play in the other countries, but that role is lacking or out of function in the industrialized countries.
Yeah, that sense of belonging and having a place within a broader community. And I always like this story of the elephants. And I can't remember the name of the ethnographer who wrote about it, but basically in a group of elephants which function as a really coherent family, an extended group, if one elephant gets mad and begins stampeding about, the other elephants form a circle around the stampeding elephant who's gone mad. And as the elephant charges this side of the circle just bends and stretches so it looks like this. And then when the elephant charges back this way, the circle stretches this way, until finally the elephant just gets itself settled down and backs its way back into the circle again. And I think that that's a good analogy, and that so many of us would welcome elephant society over the current one, where there's room for the rampage, and then when it's run its course, we could simply move ourselves back into the circle and take our part in the circle again, that the circle's elastic enough to hold the totality of our experience. I think we're all looking for that in some sense. We Westerners are lonely people in some way that way. We've lost what is fundamental about what binds us together.
Being in a group.
Yeah. Being in a group, being a member of a group, being integral, that without me, the sense that I must be in the group because without me the group isn't the group. And that sense of really I must be with the group is missing for so many of us, I think. And that's why sometimes peer support becomes so powerful, because we finally find a group where we are needed and wanted and respected. And when I look in the face of a service user, it's like looking in a mirror that shines a beautiful reflection back to me, not some distortion which seeks to colonize me, but rather I see in the face of the other service user something of beauty, and therefore can begin to see it in myself. And that's healing.